Well, the first of the Churro episodes has concluded, and this was an interesting game, to say the least. With Beatrice out of the picture and Battler refusing to participate in the game, this time Lambda Delta takes over as the Game Master, and Bernkestel takes over Battler's role as the Denier of Witches. Bernkestel shows why she is, as she stated, the cruelest witch of them all with the introduction of her game piece, the Master Detective and Intellectual Rapist, Erika Furudo. This was a much different game board, beginning with us starting at the end of the game, with Erika doing her best Phoenix Wright impression and declaring Natsui as the culprit. As Peace Battler, we are then taken back to the beginning to see just how the story progressed to this point. This episode seems to lean more into the love aspect of the story, with Battler finally willing to try and understand Beatrice and her motivations, along with the romantic subtext between them, such as him leaping from the window carrying her in his arms, and their tearful goodbye to each other at the end of the trial. There's also the romance of the story itself, as shown in the tea party with Virgilia and Delanor's discussion about the love between a reader and author. Through the different positions of Battler and Erika, we see how the attitude you approach the mystery will lead you to different answers. Erika represents the persistent side of the detective's pursuit of truth at any cost, while Battler approaches the mystery with love, where he's more concerned with the why did they do this than the how it was done. Erika comes off as disrespectful to the reader because all she cares about is creating a plausible solution to the mystery, even if it means twisting the truth to conform to her theory. Once she decides to pursue Natsui as the culprit, she selectively uses information pointing towards that solution. An example of this is regarding Kinzo being alive. Erika knows that Kinzo is actually dead, but she still acts like he's alive because it's convenient to her theory. Erika even goes so far as to accuse Natsui of having an affair with Kinzo and disrespecting the Ushiramiya name, with Bernkestel twisting the knife by declaring in red that Kinzo never trusted or respected Natsui. Contrast this with how Battler approached the game. He may have been stubborn, naive, and over-emotional, but he did everything with love, and this love culminates with his defense of Natsui at the end. While he is uncertain of her guilt, he becomes increasingly incensed by the witches attacking her character and steps up to defend her honor. And of course, he shows love in his defense of Beato's game, getting angry at the witches for perverting it and claiming that it's meant to be between himself and Beato. He understands what Beatrice's true motive behind the game is, which is Battler understanding Beatrice, or more specifically, atoning for a sin he committed, and he's determined to finish the game to give her peace. And because Battler played his game with love, it is he, not Erika, who comes to the truth behind the story, and is thus able to wield the golden truth and ascend to the title of Endless Sorcerer. This episode also gives the reader the tools needed to help uncover the truth through the introduction of Delanor A. Knox and the Knox's Decalogue. The fact that Battler was able to reach the final truth shows that all the clues you need to solve the mystery have already been given. And in fact, the game recommends going through the previous games with this new knowledge to come to the true conclusion. And while I have not had the time to go in depth through each previous episode, I will attempt to give my general theories on the whodunit, howdunit, and whydunit of this game board. This episode focused heavily on Natsui and the aftermath of Kinzo's death. We learned that, surprisingly, it was Natsui's idea to keep up the illusion that Kinzo was dead in order to buy time for Kraus to recoup his financial losses. We can see the toll it takes on her mental state, and it's exasperated by a mysterious man who knows a dark secret from her past and is hell-bent on revenge, but we'll touch on that in a bit. The game takes place in the year 1986, and it has been confirmed in this episode that Kinzo died a year earlier in 1985. So now we know Kinzo is dead by the start of every episode. The list of people who know that Kinzo is dead is as follows: Kraus, Natsui, Kumasawa, Nanjo, Canon, Shannon, and Genji. What does that mean for the overall story? Well, you have to look back at all the times a character either mentioned seeing or speaking to Kinzo, or any scene where we directly see a character talking to Kinzo, and figure out what it means in this new context. Every instance where one of these characters visits Kinzo is a lie. There were many instances of Natsui, Kraus, Nanjo, and the servants speaking to Kinzo throughout the game. And I believe there were also times people who aren't a part of that core group also claimed they saw Kinzo throughout the story. I believe Rosa did in episode 2, but I can't remember any other specific instances. And of course, we have Kinzo appearing to the siblings in episode 4. What is the thread that connects all this? Is that at least some characters are working together to spin a narrative. I imagine the people that are drawn into this conspiracy change from episode to episode, but the mastermind Beatrice is roping in the family, whether through bribing or blackmail, to keep up a lie for his or her own reason. Of course, the biggest new information of this story was the mysterious baby that apparently died 19 years ago when Natsui shoved the servant holding it off a cliff. Natsui receives a call from an unknown man, claiming to be the baby Natsui killed 19 years ago, and tells her that he is coming on the day of the conference for revenge. So who is the man that is harassing Natsui? Well, the first question to ask is if the baby died or not. If it died, the person on the phone knows about it, despite the attempted cover-up. So, how did anyone learn about the deaths of the baby and servant? We know from flashbacks that Kumasawa knew about the baby and may have had her suspicions surrounding its death. So, somebody in present day obtaining that information isn't out of the question. As for who is behind the calls, maybe the siblings learned about this baby and had someone call Natsui as the ghost of the dead baby to make her paranoid and off-kilter in an effort to get her to slip up in her efforts to hide Kinzo. While this is possible, it doesn't seem like the most likely scenario to me. If the baby lived, there's somebody in our cast, as it's stated that the caller is not someone who was just introduced in this game board. The most likely suspects are Badler, Jessica, Shannon, or Canon. First, I'll say it's most likely not Jessica. Natsui had thoughts to herself from her point of view about being pregnant with Jessica multiple times throughout the game. I understand the idea of an unreliable narrator, but I find it hard to believe when talking to herself that she would state something untrue like being pregnant with Jessica when she wasn't. So I'll declare that Jessica being the secret baby as being highly unlikely. Could it be Badler? The age is off, but only by a year. We know Badler is not Rudolph's first wife's real son, which means he had him out of wedlock. In that case, maybe Kinzo didn't get some random baby, but got his illegitimate grandchild and told Natsui to raise it as her own. When the accident happened, Kinzo suspected Natsui and gave Badler back to Rudolph. As for Badler making the calls, normally I would say it's out of character for him, but in this arc, Meta Badler showed up late and hasn't been controlling his own peace. This could explain why the calls only happen in this arc. Somebody with more knowledge than Badler now controls his peace and is making it do things he normally wouldn't do. There were no indications that Badler had this knowledge in any previous episodes, which leads me to the conclusion that the baby isn't Badler. But his outburst at the end indicates that he was at least involved, and could have made the calls on the baby's behalf. Because if Badler is an accomplice, then according to Knox's Ninth, it is permitted for observers to let their own conclusions and explanations be heard. His viewpoint can't be trusted. This is what allowed him to see Kinzo while he was outside with Erika solving the epitaph, even though we know he's dead. Nothing that has happened from his viewpoint in this particular game can be trusted now, which opens up a lot of possibilities. For example, Badler could have made the calls at the orders of someone else, which leads me to suspect that Canon is the baby. I haven't made it a secret that Shannon has been my #1 suspect for a while. So if we assume the person who is calling Natsui is the person behind the previous murders of the other game boards, I'd lean towards Shannon as the culprit in this game too. And to be fair, while the baby is most likely male, that's never explicitly stated in red. Natsui never once refers to it as anything other than the baby. Shannon is also made suspicious because she's the only one who knows Natsui's favorite season, but honestly, I'm not sure how damning that is. However, the male voice over the phone is what throws me off. If the baby was Shannon, why would the voice be distinctly masculine? Natsui would obviously know the sex of the baby, so if it was Shannon, having a male voice makes no sense. So in that regard, I believe the most likely suspect is Canon. When the baby was discovered to be alive after the accident, Kinzo hid the baby in the orphanage and brought it back to Rokenjima as a servant when they were an appropriate age. In this case, considering Canon only started working for the family a few years ago, he seems more than likely. Speaking of age, who's to say Shannon or Canon is actually 16? If they don't know their parentage, it would be easy for Kinzo to doctor a birth certificate to have it say whatever he wants. This also brings up the question of why Kinzo has such an interest in this seemingly random baby. enough to essentially have it be in line to become the future head of the Ushiramiyas if it was being passed off as his eldest son's child. Well, what if Canon was Kinzo and Beatrice's secret child? Natsui killing the servant and Rosa meeting Beatrice both happened in 1967. This game takes place in 1986, meaning their child would be 19, the same age as the baby. Is it possible that Kenzo had a baby with this woman he had hidden away before she died, and passed the baby onto Natsui to hide its parentage and keep his child close by? Perhaps upon learning the truth, maybe at Kinzo's deathbed or through other means, the baby, aka Canon, lost his mind and set up this whole killing game as revenge on Natsui, which explains why this particular game is so cruel to her. And while Canon could have called Natsui himself, I believe he enlisted Battler since he hasn't seen the rest of the family in years, so Natsui wouldn't be as familiar with his voice as opposed to a servant she sees every day. It may just be a coincidence or red herring that the man on the phone sounds suspiciously like Battler, but I still feel he has some role in this setup. So I've already touched on some of my theories, but now let's get into the whodunit, howdunit, and whydunit for this game board. Whodunit, Canon being helped by Shannon. Whydunit. I've stated multiple times that the overall motive throughout the previous game boards was that Battler made a promise 6 years ago and couldn't keep it because he never returned to Rokenjima. It's even referenced again at the end of this game, with Beatrice calling Battler a liar that doesn't keep his promises. I believe it was the promise he made to Shannon 6 years ago, to whisk her away on a white horse away from her life as a servant. However, figuring out the motive for murder in this particular game board is more difficult. While Beatrice still appears in this game as a piece and claims she's responsible for the murders, she is not the game master this time, and rather than focusing on getting Battler to accept witches, the motive this time is to get Natsui to admit to what she had done 19 years ago. So the question then is the person who is behind these murders as revenge on Natsui the same culprit behind all the other games in previous episodes? I believe this whole game was faked by the family and servants in order to put pressure on Natsui and Kraus to admit the truth about Kinzo. Hence the siblings' insistence that Kinzo had to know of the murders and pushing to see him in person. Problem is, the people from this fake first Twilight still end up dead. But one of the rules throughout this game has been, if someone solves the epitaph, then Beatrice will stop the murders. But we've seen an instance of murders continuing after the epitaph has been solved before. In episode 3, Ava solved the epitaph, but she kept committing murders for reasons unrelated to the epitaph. And like with Ava committing murder for her own reasons, the motive in this game has changed. These murders are no longer related to the epitaph, therefore Beatrice has no obligation to stop killing. This explains why, unlike previous games, the bodies aren't displayed in accordance with the epitaph and seem to disappear entirely. So while the culprit is still using the epitaph as a basis for their game, at least in the beginning, their motive in this game is different. They're no longer concerned about the survivor solving the epitaph and obtaining the gold. They simply want to frame Natsui and pressure her to confess to the murder she committed 19 years ago. So my belief is, assuming Canon is the baby from 19 years ago, he has different intentions with this game, which makes sense given that Beatrice is not the game master for this episode. Maybe Shannon is also complicit in the murders, like I assume she has been in previous games. But now she wants revenge for Canon after learning the truth of his heritage. Howdunit. For the events of this particular game, there's a lot fewer deaths than in previous game boards, but things are made difficult by Erika's many, many red truths that seem to implicate that Natsui could be the only logical culprit. So we understand that Erika's goal is to prove a human is behind the murders. And of course, by this point, we can say that true magic is not behind the events of this or any game board. But I'll come at this from another angle and say, like I've theorized in the previous game, that this was a coordinated game that the siblings and servants participated in that ended in murder by Beatrice. So let's break it down. First Twilight. The initial First Twilight was a setup to create a situation where they forced Natsui to admit that Kinzo was dead all along, and used this evidence to force Kraus to accept Battler's claim for the headship. Battler was pressured to agree with the plan, the same way he was pressured to sit in at the family conference. This seems to be the first time Battler ever actively joins in on one of these setups. But as mentioned before, Battler did not control his piece, hence why he did things in this game he normally wouldn't do. Everyone was in on the conspiracy, except Erika, Natsui, and possibly Kraus. Badler solved the epitaph and was given the head's ring, therefore the servants would listen to the new head and participate without question. While Erika was in the guest house with Nanjo and Goda, the people in the dining hall came up with the plan to get Natsui to admit the truth about Kinzo. After 1 a.m., Rosa returned to the guest house and convinced the cousins to pretend to be dead. At some point, Kraus is taken to a mystery location. If he was in on the plan, I can only assume he was blackmailed to participate and told to pretend to be taken hostage. If he was legitimately kidnapped, I'm assuming it was while Natsui had holed herself up in her room at the instructions of the man on the phone. At 7 a.m. on the 5th, Badler starts screaming to alert Erika. As Badler explained, the victims were not dead when Badler screamed, and instead were killed later. Nobody who isn't in on the plan was allowed to see the bodies. After everyone leaves, those who pretended to be dead sneak off and hide somewhere on the island. However, sometime between the mock first twilight and October 5th, the six encountered the culprit and were killed, and their corpses were left undiscovered. The same culprit killed Kraus. Nobody but the killer knows they are actually dead. Second twilight. Just like with the first twilight, Hideyoshi was not actually killed, at least not initially. The caller instructed Natsui to hide in the closet of that particular room at a specific time to make her the most likely suspect. Hideyoshi then went into the room and pretended to be attacked. This is why, once again, his body is wrapped in blankets and everyone prevents Erika from seeing the body or examining the room. This is pretty much the vaguest murder in the entire series, since there is no red truth dedicated to it, and it was barely discussed at all during the trial. But something that caught my attention was when Erika was giving her final speech. Ava was very agitated, smacking Natsui around and screaming at her for killing her husband. Either she's the greatest actress in the world, or something actually did happen to Hideyoshi between the time we saw his body be carried off and this confrontation. Because why would Ava only accuse Natsui of killing her husband, but say nothing about her son? Maybe because Ava is still unaware George had been killed, but Hideyoshi actually was found dead. It could also just be that Ava knew Natsui was in the room where Hideyoshi was quote-unquote murdered because they had planned it out that way, but it was still something that jumped out to me as strange. And of course, there's the infamous knock and letter riddle. Badler, Rudolph, Kyrie, Ava, Hideyoshi, Rosa, Shannon, and Canon are in the dining hall when there's a knock on the door. When Canon checks it out, there's a letter on the ground from Beatrice with the family head's ring that declares Badler the new family head. I racked my brain with this riddle for a while because there were so many red truths connected to it. However, if I go on my theory that this was all a pre-planned game by the family, there's a simple solution. Lambda Delta uses words like misidentify, mistake, and misinterpret in her red truths, but she never denies that someone could pretend to hear a knock. Therefore, there was no knocking at all. Everyone lied about it. Canon only pretended to hear a knocking sound, then acted out finding this letter in the hallway, and everyone in the dining hall corroborated the story. We're seeing this event take place from Badler's point of view, but his account of events is no longer an objective one, so it can't be taken at face value. It seemed that this game was set up in advance simply to force Natsui and Kraus to admit the truth of what happened to Kinzo, but Erika the master detective showed up unexpectedly on the island, which caused an issue. With her detective authority, she could throw a wrench in their plans and ruin the whole game. Thankfully, she seemed as happy to pin the murders onto Natsui as the rest of the family. The problem is, this game was never supposed to end in actual murder, but as Erika herself stated, wherever a detective goes, death is inevitable. Beatrice used this game to isolate the victims and kill them, unbeknownst to the rest of the co-conspirators. This whole hypothesis I have hinges on the idea that this was a conspiracy created by the family to fake the deaths of the victims, and that Badler in particular must have participated, or much of my theory falls apart. Whoever the culprit is behind the murders wasn't satisfied with just having Natsui admit that Kinzo was dead like the rest of the family wanted. They wanted to break her. And what better way than to frame her for the multiple murders, including those of her beloved husband and daughter. That's why I believe the mastermind is Shannon or Canon. They were left alive at the end because they were the murderers and wanted to see Natsui break down and confess to her crime. Similar to the previous games where Beatrice killed everyone around Badler, leaving him alive until the end so he could admit his sin. Either way, there is a distinct lack of love and honor behind this game, which makes sense given who's controlling the pieces for this game board. Okay, so that will do it for my theory and discussion episode for Chapter 5 of Umineko. Apologies for those hoping I'd go back through all the previous game boards to break them down, but if I attempted that, this video would have taken at least another few weeks to make. Episode 6 is next, featuring Battler as the newly assigned Game Master. And with Battler having finally reached the truth of Beatrice's story, I'm excited to see if we'll finally get some concrete answers to the main mysteries posed throughout the previous 5 games. I hope you enjoyed this long overdue video, and look forward to Episode 6 Dawn of the Golden Witch starting next Friday. Until then, bye guys. Special shoutouts to my top tier patrons: Nana, Kaori Mikoto, Revealing Storm, Tequila Mockingbird, Jared Fan, Saya, Asborn Kennedy, Harry Gazif, Icognito, Locus Corolus, Pancake G, and Mad Goldsmith.